Here's another hello from West Virginia. Thought I was in West Virginia. Well, what I do know is joke of the day, and I know you're waiting for joke of the day, so let's get to it. What's a cow's favorite type of movie? You know, a cow, like an animal, what's its favorite type of movie? A musical. Oh, these are awesome, aren't they? Okay, the other thing that's awesome is being able to determine the x and the y-intercepts from ordered pairs and from graphs. So let's determine first how we find that x and the y-intercept. We've talked about this before. Remember, mathematicians are not creative people at all. We call it like we see it. So if this is the graph that I'm looking at, an x-intercept is kind of like an x-interception, and we looked at that before. So it's where the graph is going to cross the x-axis. That's why this helps. The mathematicians are not creative. So here, we've got a picture. Here's my graph. It's crossing the x-axis right there. That's going to be my x-intercept. Now, when we think about that x-intercept, remember, the point could be here, but if my line's tilting in another direction, that x-intercept could sit over here, could sit over here, 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 here. Any of these points could be an x-intercept because any of these points are spots where a line could cross that x-axis. So when you think about any of these points, there's something very special that we know about every single one of those points. Every one of them, notice, they don't go up or down at all on that y-axis. So if they don't go up or down at all on the y-axis, what does it mean about the y-coordinate for every one of these points? Yes, that y-coordinate has got to be 0 because 0 indicates no up or down movement. Now the x-coordinate could be anything. It could be positive over here, it could be negative over here, it could be a fraction, it could be a decimal. For that matter, the x could as well be a 0. But x could be anything. What I definitely know about an x-intercept, since it sits on this axis, the y-coordinate will be a 0. So frequently we call x-intercepts zeros. Sometimes we call them roots. Sometimes we call them solutions. And all of these are because this is what happens whenever you make the y-coordinate 0. Typically when you have an equation, like something that perhaps might look like this, and when you have this equation and you make the y 0, you're going to solve the equation for x. And so that's why they're called solutions, roots, and sometimes called zeros. X-intercept at all means the very same thing. Now let's take a look at this notion of a y-intercept. If the x-intercept is where the graph crosses this x-axis, then what's a y-intercept going to be? Yeah, it's going to be where the graph crosses the y-axis. Again, helps so much that mathematicians are not creative. Man, that helps. So here's that graph again. Here's my y-axis. Notice that it's crossing that y-axis right at that point. So there's my y-intercept. But just like with an x-intercept, we know that the y-coordinate is going to be 0, no matter if the x-intercept sits over here or over here. Same idea with a y-intercept. It could sit up here, it could sit down here, but regardless of whether it sits up here or down here, every one of the points on this y-axis, notice every one of them has no left or right movement. Which of these two variables indicates that left or right movement? Yes, it's the x-coordinate that indicates the left or right movement. So if there isn't any left or right movement, what does it mean about the x? Yes, it's going to be a 0. Now that y could be anything at all. The y could be positive and sit up here. It could be negative and sit down here. It could be a fraction. It could be a decimal. It could be an irrational number. But the point is the x-coordinate will be 0. So because of that, if we have, for instance, a string of ordered pairs, and we need to get the x-intercept or the y-intercept, if we're looking for an x-intercept, we're looking for the point that has a y-coordinate of 0. If we're looking for the y-intercept, we're looking for the point that has an x-coordinate of 0. So I've got several examples we're going to be looking at, and we're going to determine the x and the y-intercepts for each one of them. So to get that x-intercept, remember, x-intercept is where the graph crosses this x-axis. Every one of these points has no up or down movement. Up or down movement is signified by the y. So I'm looking for the point that has a y-coordinate of 0. Well, right here, there's a y-coordinate of 0. So that means that my x-intercept for this particular example is going to be that point, -2, 0. Now, to get the y-intercept, Remember, the y-intercept is where it crosses this axis right here. On this axis, we have no left or right movement. Left or right movement is signified by the x-coordinate. So that means I'm looking for the point that has an x of 0. Well, here's an x of 0, and that's the only point that has an x of 0. So my y-intercept then is going to be the point 0.05. All right, let's do the same thing down here. X-intercept. Remember, if you can't remember remember this right here and this right here, and quite frankly, I'm going to give you a hint, I don't have them memorized. I can't remember it. So what I do is I always go x-intercept. That crosses this axis. This axis has no up or down movement. That means the y-coordinate has got to be 0. So which of these points has a y-coordinate of 0? Right there. So my x-intercept then is going to be that point of -8, 0. And folks, it's so important that you write your intercepts in coordinate form, even though some teachers and some textbooks won't make you do that. It is so important because the point -2, 0 and the point 0, -2 are two entirely different spots. -2, 0 is going to sit back here. But 0, -2 is going to sit down here. See, those are two entirely different spots. So it's very, very important that you know where the 0 goes in that coordinate. My classes, my students, I always make them put it in this coordinate form so that we make sure they know where the 0 goes so that they get the point in the right spot on the 2D coordinate plane. Now, let's talk about that y-intercept. Remember, if you can't remember this stuff right here, just go like this. Y-intercept is where it crosses this y-axis. Any point on this axis here has no left or right movement. That's the x-coordinate that's going to be 0. So which of these has an x-coordinate of 0? None of them do. Now remember, in order to get a y-intercept, I have to have an x-coordinate of 0. That's the only way to get a y-intercept because it's got to cross this axis. Every one of these points has no left or right movement. The x-coordinate has got to be a 0. So since none of these has a coordinate of 0 at that x, then I can't make any of them be that y-intercept. So therefore, I don't have a y-intercept, and I'm going to write none. Do not write this. That indicates the point 0, 0 is your y-intercept. The point 0, 0 is not even in there. And don't write this because that just doesn't make any sense at all. Say that you don't have one, write out none. Okay, so now let's take a look at some graphs and pull out those x and y intercepts on the graphs. Take a look at this first one. Remember, x-intercept is where the graph crosses this axis right here. Now, where is this graph crossing this axis? It's not. Remember, you have to go by the definition of x-intercept. It has to be where it crosses this axis. So if it doesn't cross, then what's that x-intercept? You're not going to have one. So I'm again going to write none. And just like I said before, don't write 0, 0. Don't write just a 0. Write out none. So now let's take a look at that y-intercept. Where is it crossing this y-axis? Yes, right here. The coordinates for that point are 0, 3. Because I've not moved left or right at all, so my x-coordinate is 0, y-coordinate is 3, and that goes along with the definition that I had said for that y-intercept. Remember I said I need an x-coordinate of 0, so this is following right along. Okay, now on the next example, once again, get that x-intercept. Where is this graph right here crossing this x-axis? It's crossing right there. The coordinates for that point are -4, 0. And that goes right along with what we had said about that x-intercept. Remember over here we said x-intercept meant make the y-coordinate 0. And that's exactly what happened there. The y-coordinate was 0. Now let's talk about the y-intercept. Here's my y-axis. Where is this graph crossing this axis? It's not at all. So once again, I don't have one. It's okay not to have an intercept. Don't freak out about that. You have to go with what the definition says. The definition of y-intercept says it's got to cross this y-axis. That graph is not crossing it. So I can't say that there's a point where it crosses when there isn't a point where it crosses. All right, so now let's take a look at this picture. X-intercept, where does this graph, now it's individual points, but where do any of those points sit on this x-axis? No, none of them sit on that axis. So once again, I'm not going to have an x-intercept. It's okay not to have one. Don't freak out about that. Go by that definition. If none of these points meets that definition, none of those points are your x-intercept. Now let's talk y-intercept. Which of these points crosses this y-axis right here? Aha, that one right there. And that is the point 0, 1. Okay, let's take a look at this one. Remember, x-intercept is where that graph is going to cross this x-axis right here. So where is this graph crossing that x-axis? Right here at this point, and that's the origin, 0, 0. Now, definition of y-intercept is that it crosses this axis. Where does this graph cross this axis? Yep, right there, at the same spot, 0, 0. And folks, just like I said, it's okay to not have one of these intercepts. It's also okay for your x and y intercepts to be the same spot. Again, you have to go by that definition. Where's it crossing this axis? Bam, right there. Where's it crossing this axis? The same spot. It's okay for them to be the same. Now let's take a look at this one. X-intercept, where is this graph right here? Where is it crossing this axis? Right here at that point. That's the point 2, 0. Again, so important you get that 0 in the right spot. If you flip that around, 0, 2 sits here. That's not even on the graph. So very important you put the 0 in the right spot. My students, you are going to write that in coordinate form every single time. Now, my y-intercept, where is it crossing this axis? Right down here. And again, the coordinates for that point are 0, -2. -2, 0 sits over here. See? So important that you know where that 0 goes. You will write it in coordinate form for me, coordinate form every time. All right, one last one. Where's the x-intercept? Where's it crossing this axis? This graph right here is crossing that axis right there, again at that origin, 0, 0. And where is this graph crossing this axis, the y-axis? Again at that same spot right there, 0, 0. And like I said before, it's okay for your x and y intercepts to be the same. It's also okay to have 2 of the same intercept. Let's take a look at that kind of an instance. Hold on just a second while I clear this board off and put this last graph up here. This is one that we have talked about before. Okay. It's your absolute value graph, but let's get the x-intercept for this one. Remember, x-intercept is where the graph crosses this x-axis right here. Where is this graph right here crossing this axis? Right here, and oh, as well right here. Oh my, I have 2 x-intercepts. Perfectly okay. Remember, you have to go by what the definition says. It's crossing here and here. So it's crossing at the point -3, 0 and at the point 3, 0. It's okay. Not only is it okay to not have one, not only is it okay for them to be the same point, it's okay to have 2 of them. Go by what that definition says. So now let's talk about those y-intercepts. Where is this graph crossing this y-axis? Way up here at only one spot. That's okay. And that is the point 0, 9. So hopefully this helps with the understanding of x and y intercepts. Remember, just go with that definition. Even if you can't remember where the 0 goes, go with that definition. Mathematicians, we really do try to make it easy. We're not creative, and that makes it easy. An x-intercept is where the graph crosses this x-axis. On this axis, every one of these points has no up or down movement. No up or down movement, that means the y-coordinate is going to be 0. Now, when you talk about a y-intercept, that's where the graph crosses this y-axis right here. Any of these points on this axis have no left or right movement. Remember, left or right movement is designated by your x. So if you don't have left or right movement, that means your x-coordinate is going to be 0. And that's what we got right there. So I hope that helps. Have a great day.